So Cindy, can you tell us a little bit about your background and sort of what got you interested in modern slavery as an issue and how you started working in that field?
Thank you. I've been working on issues of social justice and international development for many years. I was working in the Department for International Development for many years and on a range of labour rights issues as well as social exclusion and gender inequality. And it became clear to me that tackling poverty and inequality requires that one looks at where people earn an income, what the role of business is, and the private sector in potentially contributing to opportunities for people to get decent jobs, but also the extent to which they can exacerbate extreme vulnerability. And so I've been working at the Ethical Trading Initiative for 4 years. I've only recently started focusing specifically on modern slavery, but have been working on labour rights in global supply chains in a collaborative effort with companies, trade unions and NGOs to recognise that tackling in real meaningful ways labour rights and labour standards requires collaborative efforts, requires systematic change over a period of time and real commitment and will to address that. And that's how I got involved.
Good. And can you please tell us a little bit about what you see as being the root causes of forced labor? What sort of things make people vulnerable to forced labor?
I think that there are multiple factors that are at play and they're interconnected. So where governments fail to protect and recognize their responsibilities as governments to look after their citizens and ensure that exploitation and abuse takes place, where there are discriminated populations and excluded populations like women, like children, disabled people, migrant workers, ethnic minorities and religious minorities and so on, they all serve to provide the fertile ground for extreme vulnerability and where people are desperate for a job or an income at almost any cost. And the places that are worst governed are places where the private sector seems to flourish in an unfettered way, and where the most vulnerable who've been denied the opportunity to get a decent education or access healthcare or social benefits in any way, or decision making in government, tend to be the ones that really lie at the most extreme end of the global supply chains, operating in the informal economy, and subject to vulnerability of exploitation.
And I mean, in this context, are there a lot of efforts to combat modern slavery and forced labor? Some focus on transparency, others on due diligence. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on the current landscape in terms of solutions to forced labor. How would you sort of rate where we're at?
It's a great question. I think that the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights provide an excellent platform for this, a framework in which there's government responsibility to protect workers. Companies have a responsibility to respect workers' rights, and workers themselves and citizens have the right to access remedy where their rights are violated. The mechanism to do that is human rights due diligence. And often people talk about human rights due diligence as the process by which you understand risk and investigate what's going on in your supply chain. ETI, actually, my organization, developed a framework that included businesses, trade unions and NGOs to develop a framework that really is not just about understanding where risks lie, but actually identifying what needs to be done about that. And so we have a 4-part framework which looks quite simple, but has got the elements of responsibility all the way along the process. So understanding where companies are sourcing goods and services from, understanding what the regulatory framework is like, what it's like for workers to organize into trade unions or civil society to have their organizations and the free media and so on, translates into a company identifying its salient risks and understanding what its responsibilities are for both contributing or causing human rights impacts, but also what their leverage is for addressing this. Many companies might find themselves sourcing 2% of a factory's supply. They have very little real leverage to initiate change. And that means they have to work with their competitors who are also sourcing from the same factories or farms. That increased leverage and the incentives that are built into the system to start to reverse the cycle of vulnerability, abuse, and exploitation can be done when you start to help companies understand they themselves on their own are not responsible for fixing the problem. They have to work with others. Where trade unions representing workers themselves feel that they have a part to play, and civil society, and indeed governments, and that you start to remedy in real time abuses and enable access to justice and compensation, and then ensure that the monitoring and review and governance and oversight of that whole system is robust within a company as well as in a collaborative space. So there is some degree of accountability. When you know what your risks are, you identify your responsibilities and your leverage, you ensure that where there are rights violations, you remedy as and when you find them, and you are in a constant cycle of review, monitoring, improving, and developing continuously your business practices and addressing them. These can't happen overnight, but we need to see progress, and evidence is one of the critical things that lies underneath that. And that's why the academic institutions like King's College and the organizations that are represented here, the academic community, has such a critical role to play in building the evidence base of what is actually happening, what's working, what isn't working, and why.
That's great. And if I can ask you something a little bit more focused on the UK, I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on the UK Modern Slavery Act. A lot of people feel that its overwhelming focus on transparency has meant that labor exploitation has become somewhat normalized, and I'm wondering to what extent you would agree with that statement, and also what your thoughts are.
I think that transparency can be a driver of change because companies are called to report publicly on what they're doing. The problem is the government has no real commitment to enforcing that pretty light touch legislation, and I think that's the biggest problem of that legislation. I do think that a company being asked to report on all the steps they are taking to address this and being held to account by both civil society, investors, other actors in the mix, trade unions and NGOs, as well as government, importantly, can actually drive change in a way that is meaningful. But I think there needs to be more competence on the side of government in understanding what they need to review, leaving it to voluntary initiatives, civil society to monitor the legislation, I think is an erroneous model. But I also think that tackling labour standards and ensuring that labour laws and working conditions are regularly enforced and inspected and adhered to has to be the foundation of that. And then transparency can start to drive the discussion further down the supply chain. We are talking to companies in a range of ways, both the international multinationals, but also their suppliers in many countries. And just having been in Pakistan last week, some of those companies that are sourcing, that are supplying to these big brands and retailers, they are compliant. Their workplaces are pretty okay. What they are starting to understand is their due diligence responsibilities to understand what lies underneath their own supply chains. And they have no real competence or understanding of how to do that, because compliance-driven approaches have only addressed the first tier, and even there they don't pick up forced labour. So we have a big task to get ownership from sourcing countries and supply chains to really better understand how they can better manage risk down their supply chain. And compliance and adherence to labour law, which is internationally binding, is a critical way of doing that.
And maybe to wrap up, could you please tell us maybe one example, or not necessarily an example, but something that gives you hope about the future of eradicating labor abuses and that agenda?
I'm excited to see companies stepping up. There are a number of examples that I can point to where tackling labor recruitment, for example, workers from Bangladesh and Sri Lanka sitting in Mauritian factories, with the involvement of some of the key global brands and retailers like ASOS and some smaller brands like Whistles and Puma and Adidas and so on, being willing to sit around the table with their suppliers, understand what the context is in Mauritius that gives rise to potential risks of modern slavery, but also recognizing that migrant workers, where they come from, those governments and partners there need to also manage the risks. So before a migrant moves from one country to another, ensuring that they understand their rights, that they haven't paid for a job and are in debt bondage, that they are given decent terms and conditions and rights alongside national workers, that labour law extends to migrant workers too, that things are interpreted in their own language. And all of those things I'm starting to see happen. We were just in Mauritius a few weeks ago. Last week in Pakistan, we had the first multi-stakeholder roundtable in the Sindh province, where we had government, we had companies, we had suppliers, we had NGOs and trade unions all around the table saying, this is our role, this is your role, this is his role, this is her role, and really identifying quite specifically who needs to do what to address these issues. We are beyond the stage of nice sounding statements and commitments at a global policy level. We've got to get very specific about what that means for workers on a given day in a given workplace. And I think by so doing, by becoming very focused and specific and understanding that due diligence is not just about understanding, it's also about doing and monitoring, I think we'll get there.